For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon. Ryhove. Author and journalist Hein Marias has written in his book South Africa Pushed to the Limits, a most penetrating analysis of their South African political and economic landscape. He is with me today to speak about his latest publication. South Africa's democratic government has worked hard at improving the lives of the black majority. However, close to half the population live in poverty. What is the problem?
It's a set of problems. The obvious. History's legacies. Let's not kid. Colonialism and apartheid left us with a real mess. And the structure of the economy's ability to create jobs, poverty trends that date back to the 1970s, and these were not just going to go away because we suddenly had a democratic government. But it doesn't explain everything, I think. And the book is an attempt to look at how much of it can be blamed on the past and how much of it is new. How much of it have to do with things we've tried to fix and maybe got wrong, or fixed halfway and not all the way. And there's a series of chapters in it that explore that in there, so I'd advise readers to go and delve into it and dive into it there. But the other big reason, I think, is simply job losses. We have a trend of massive job losses that goes back to the early 1970s. At first it's driven by firms and companies starting to introduce new technologies and machineries in order to keep their profit rates up. And it's also an attempt to reduce at the same time the growing power of workers and trade unionists in South Africa. And this runs its course more or less in the 1990s, and a new squeeze then gets placed on labor, and that's basically the terms and benefits of workers happen. So we have this shift, which is a global one, towards more informal labor, out-contracting, outsourcing labor, and so on. This has a huge effect because we have something in South Africa now which we didn't really have to the same extent 20 years ago. We have working poor here right now, people who have a job, who have a wage, and they are still poor. And this is a very new reality for us here, one the government, I think, is struggling to deal with, and it's not going to go away simply with new laws. It's a tough one to crack. And the third thing, I think, is we don't have a coherent and powerful anti-poverty strategy. It's as simple as that. We have bits and pieces, but it's haphazard and it's patchy. We have other things doing the work of an anti-poverty strategy.
You mentioned that strategic choices made since the early 1990s have compounded these types of handicaps. What are you referring to?
I think we have to go back and look at not what our macroeconomic policies gear and subsequently promised, but what they actually achieved. And I think the one thing we can say quite clearly is that they did not achieve job growth on the scale nearly as promised. I think that's indisputable. The second is they didn't achieve growth on the scale that was promised either. We had 3 years, 2004 to 2007, where GDP growth was about 5%, and then it plummeted again. So on none of those scores did it deliver the promised and advertised benefits there. And I think we then have to ask, okay, if it didn't deliver the benefits, what damage might it have done to us? Or what changed? What made it more difficult for government to deal with some of these issues we just talked about, poverty, joblessness, and so on? And I think one of them is that it enabled companies to restructure themselves with not necessarily South Africa as a priority for their operations anymore. We've seen massive divestment. Companies, large corporations, moving abroad and restructuring themselves on the continental and global fields, basically. The idea was that they would raise capital abroad and reinvest it in South Africa. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. Certainly not on the scale that was anticipated. So, for example, if you look in the mid-2000s, for example, we found that companies, 2,100 companies, South African companies, were active abroad. About 3/4 of them in Africa and about 1/4 of them in OECD countries. And they represented 82 of the top firms in the JSE, and very little of that money came back into South Africa in the form of productive investment. What did happen, though, is, and this is thanks to our liberalization of our financial controls, again following a global trend, but we have seen emerge a massive financial sector here, which is a parasitical one. I don't think there's any kinder word to be used to describe it. It's worth about 20% of our GDP right now. 15 years ago, it was 6% of our GDP. And it is not engaged in productive investment. About 10% of our private credit extension in the mid-2000s went into what we can reasonably call productive investment. So these are legacies which are in part the imprints of global trends, but they're also in part the imprints of choices we have made in trying to deal with our other legacies in there. And I think some of them have had the effect of making a more just and livable society that much more difficult to achieve today.
Who have come out as the big winners in the democratic South Africa, and why do you say this?
Look, I think corporate South Africa is a big winner. They, as I said, have been able to restructure themselves in ways that weren't quite possible in the 1980s for a whole set of reasons that I think we're all familiar with. They were able to do it not just within the boundaries of South Africa, but to explore new opportunities for investment, expansion, and adaptation as well. And they were able to do this during the heyday of globalization as well, really ride the tide of globalization. So I think the big winners have been corporate, particularly conglomerate South African capital. But there's something else that's happened in that process as well, and it has a lot to do with black economic empowerment. It's got to do with the fact that a junior elite has also been cultivated with the often quite vigorous support of South African corporations as well. And this elite has developed, has made emerge around and inside the ANC a powerful lobby for the kinds of policies that corporate South Africa favors and would like to see. They're in a much stronger position today, I think, corporate South Africa, than they were 15 years ago, in keeping this, what I think would generally be called business-friendly policies in place than they were in 1994. And that's partly because many of them right now are linked in with forces inside the ANC, who are business people, aspiring business people, and some quite clearly very successful ones, for now at least. So these networks and alliances that are being built between, let's call it older, incumbent capital in South Africa and the new emerging capital are emerging very, very quickly. There are a lot of cultural, racial, and other tensions and contradictions that remain. But if you go back in history and you compare to the way in which Afrikaner and English capital came to see each other on more or less equal terms, sort of 50s, early 60s in particular, I think we're going at it much faster here than they managed to do back there.
Some described Zuma's victory over Mbeki at Polokwane as an effort to put the revolution back on track. But in your book, you suggest possible baser motives, that it was really a coalition of the wounded or a gallery of scoundrels that ousted Mbeki. Is that all it was about?
It was about that, to a certain extent. But I also think it emerged from the realization of the ANC that its authority, the trust that South Africans vested in it, was starting to erode. And this was partly because of some of the things we've already talked about. People not getting jobs, people not getting houses, people not managing to escape poverty, certainly not at the pace at which they thought they would be. And I think that part of what was required was a recuperation. And it was quite clear to many in the ANC that this was not possible under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki, for a bunch of reasons that I think we don't have to remind ourselves of either. So a new figure was needed, and this new figure had to represent the old ANC, the ANC that was the custodian, the deliverer of national liberation. This narrative that had somehow been sidetracked or detoured or hijacked, as some would put it, back in the mid-1990s. And Jacob Zuma was very consciously turned into this figure. It was a dramatic, theatrical selling operation that I think happened. A lot of the left in Kusatu and the Communist Party bought into it, and very vigorously so, because they could see benefits for themselves in this operation. But the big task of it was to convince enough South Africans, particularly supporters of the ANC, ones becoming increasingly restive and disgruntled, that don't worry, we're fixing things. We are now going to be the party that you voted for in 94 and in 99 again. We are going to be the party that improves the lives of all. The thing with that is it only buys you time. You then have to get around to actually doing that. And I think that's where we're at right now. This new government and this new leadership in the ANC is understanding how difficult it is to do that. And of course we see the results of this. The Kusatu that is more and more angry, feels let down, feels betrayed even, and many ordinary South Africans who are going out protesting about the same things they were protesting about before the Zuma-Mbeki battle emerged. So in some ways I think we're almost back to where we were when this whole drama, this theatrical duel between Mbeki and Zuma was taking root in the mid-2000s.
And just one final question, do you think that's a good thing that we're going back to where we were?
No, because the crises that had to be dealt with have not been dealt with yet. We have an economic crisis, an economy that cannot produce jobs for more than a quarter of the working population is an economy in crisis. I do not care what your GDP figures tell you. An economy that cannot guarantee the basic prospect of a half dignifying life is an economy in crisis, and that's where we're at. I don't think anybody wants to be there. And of course the social crisis that spins off from that, people's sense of anger at their politicians, their sense of betrayal and so on. I think it's really dangerous, because I think we're entering a period where the prospect of instability, of low-key instability, but chronic instability, is becoming more and more real. And the ANC, because it is still the most powerful and most popular political force in the country, is going to have to deal with that in some way. Chapters in the book deal with what it's likely to do, what signs do we already discern. And I'm afraid they're not all progressive and happy ones. I don't think those are things I'd be happy about.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Donate now and give 15 Rand a month. SMS JOIN to 41486.